Wednesday, May 26, 2021 afternoon session of the Portland City Council. Good afternoon, Keelan. Can you please call the roll?
Good afternoon, Mayor. Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry about that. Ryan.
Here.
Hardesty.
Here.
Maps.
Here.
Rubio.
Here.
Wheeler.
Here. Under Portland City Code and state law, the City Council is holding this meeting electronically. All members of the council are attending remotely by video and teleconference, and the city has made several avenues available for the public to listen to the audio broadcast of this meeting. The meeting is available to the public on the city's YouTube channel, eGov PDX, www.portlandoregon.gov/video, and channel 30. The public can also provide written testimony to the council by emailing our council clerk at cctestimony@portlandoregon.gov. The council is taking these steps as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and the need to limit in-person contact, as well as to promote physical distancing. The pandemic is an emergency that threatens the public health, safety, and welfare, which requires us to meet remotely by electronic communications. Thank you all for your patience, your flexibility, and your understanding as we manage through these challenging circumstances to conduct the city's business. And now we'll hear from legal counsel on the rules of order and decorum. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. To participate in council meetings, you may sign up in advance with the council clerk's office for communications to briefly speak about any subject. You may also sign up for public testimony on resolutions or first readings of ordinances. The published council agenda at portlandoregon.gov/auditor contains information about how and when you may sign up for testimony while the city council is holding electronic meetings. Your testimony should address the matter being considered at the time. When testifying, please state your name for the record. Your address is not necessary. Please disclose if you're a lobbyist. If you're representing an organization, please identify it. The presiding officer determines the length of testimony. Individuals generally have 3 minutes to testify unless otherwise stated. When your time is up, the presiding officer will ask you to conclude. Disruptive conduct, such as shouting, refusing to conclude your testimony when your time is up, or interrupting others' testimony or council deliberations will not be allowed. If there are disruptions, a warning will be given that further disruption may result in the person being placed on hold or ejected from the remainder of the electronic meeting. Please be aware that all city council meetings are recorded.
All right, thank you very much. We have one item for this afternoon. 397, please.
Amend the zoning map, Title 33 Planning and Zoning, and the Title 32 Signs and Related Regulations to implement the Design Overlay Zone Amendments project to update the process and tools of the Design Overlay Zone and related code sections.
Very well, and we will start with the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. Sandra Wood, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, commissioners. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can get started with this afternoon's conversation. Thank you for having us again today. We're continuing the conversation from the DOZA hearing that was held 2 weeks ago on May 12th. This project improves every aspect of the design review program. As you might remember, everything from the rules about how projects are reviewed to who reviews them and what criteria are used. Just to refresh your memory, this is an amendment to our zoning code and our zoning map. So we're in a land use hearing continuation. We wanted to again recognize that City Council is really engaged in many pressing issues at this time. So we wanted to thank you for your attention today and to remind you that basically this tool for the design overlay zone is used on 60% of the new housing units that we expect in the next 20 years. And so all the discussions that we have today affects that many units. And we really feel that these tools help Portland to build back in a better way as the economy recovers by making it easier and quicker for new construction to take place. At the same time, the tools really advance the community's goals for creating great urban places that Portland's known for and that will, of course, last for many years to come. So that's why we're here today, and thank you for your attention on this matter. Our staff team is comprised of planners from Bureau of Planning Sustainability and Bureau of Development Services, as shown on this first slide. Laura, Phil, and I from BPS will be presenting on behalf of the team. We also have a couple of other colleagues here from different other bureaus. From the Bureau of Transportation, we have Courtney Duke, and from the Housing Bureau, we have Jesse Connor, in case we needed their assistance in the discussion today. Let me go to the next slide. So for today, we'll recap what we heard from public testimony on the 12th and through the written testimony. And then staff will present these 6 issues, which are ones we've been discussing with various offices in City Hall. No real amendments are being proposed today. So if you're a member of the public watching us and this conversation, there won't be motions and movements for amendments today. That'll come later, and I'll share that in the next steps. But our plan is to share on these 6 subjects, the PSC's recommendations and any new ideas that have come up with these issues. Then we'll pause for each one and have the commissioners discuss each one as we go along. So I hope that works for you. We'll just stop at the end of each one of these. Thank you, Commissioner Hardesty. I appreciate your thumbs up there. So I'll have Phil recap the testimony. He has been busy reading and reading the testimony, so he has the best pulse on that. And I'll have him share with that, and then we'll just get started with issue number 1 after that. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Phil Namedy with Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. And just wanted to recap both what we received in writing and what you heard. 2 weeks ago, we had 51 people come and testify to the virtual public hearing. We've also received about 230 pieces of individual testimony. In some cases, single individuals submitted multiple pieces of testimony. I wanted to just go over some of the common themes of that testimony, which some of the more popular kind of opinions we heard, but by no means is exhaustive. So it does not include all opinions that came in on this project. First off, there were several commentators that gave support to DOZA and their recommended draft in general. And several showed appreciation for the flexibility of these new standards that we've developed. At the same time, there are others that came in and supported the current design review process and gave a shout out to the Design Commission and staff for handling those design reviews. Many people had asked to incorporate the work of the Selwood Moreland and PDX Main Street's work, Selwood Moreland, or SMILE, as many people know. And what both of those groups have submitted guidelines and standards that are specific to inner Portland main streets. And so we got quite a few comments expressing support for including those standards in our citywide guidelines and standards. I did want to mention also that advocates for PDX Main Streets also supported more distinct and character-driven guidelines, potentially looking at plan districts in the future. They supported greater public participation in individual reviews and possibly promoting demolition processes in some commercial areas. There was support for the Portland Neighbors Welcome letter, and that letter supported DOZA in general, as it was recommended by the PSC, but also asked for some specific changes to remove some of the complexity within the standards, such as the additional standards for taller buildings, the higher review for taller buildings. Also, Portland Neighbors Welcome was opposed to lowering the thresholds, which was something that the PDX Main Street folks advocated for. And Portland Neighbors Welcome are also concerned about adding detailed character statements or other guidelines, restrictions that are specific to certain neighborhoods. Portland Neighbors Welcome and others suggested expanding the Type 2 design review option to other affordable housing projects. As a counterpoint, there were several testifiers that expressed concern that the thresholds allowing the use of the standards or a lower level of design review were considered too high and should be reduced. especially considering the existing built fabric of some of these commercial districts. And then finally, several people from Arbor Lodge wrote in requesting to expand the M overlay in more commercial areas within their neighborhood, both along Interstate Avenue and in some smaller commercial nodes. I do want to note that DOZA did not analyze or propose any changes to the M overlay, which was recently established in 2018 as part of our mixed use zones and comp plan update project. And generally the M overlay applies in designated centers. So that's a quick summary. I do want to just mention that the written testimony is available to be viewed on our map app. And you can just click on the view public testimony line and select DOZA. And it comes up in reverse chronological order, starting with May 14th, which was when we closed the testimony. I'm going to pause right here and see if anybody with the commission has any questions about the testimony before moving forward.
Thank you, colleagues. Any questions? None so far.
Okay, so I am going to go on. We're going to start working on the 6 sort of items that we've identified. First one here has to do with bridges. And the question that we're looking at for discussion is design review and bridges within the right-of-way. There's been past confusion about whether a bridge is a standard or non-standard improvement, which we won't get into the details on that, but that difference between a standard and non-standard improvement is what determines whether something in the right-of-way is subject to design review or not. Generally, a standard improvement is exempt from design review. So definitely bridges can have a transformative impact on an area, much like a larger building. However, bridges often have their own stakeholder and public review processes driven by the agency. They're also subject to funding and approval processes as major infrastructure projects. Bridges often do not go through the standard permitting process that buildings do, that is administered by Development Services. In many cases, agencies have come through and briefed the Design Commission when a bridge is in the design overlay zone, but that's not always the case. So when this was discussed during the PSC work sessions, the PSC made the recommendation that any bridge with a span of 60 feet, more than 60 feet within the D overlay be subject to a type 3 design review. The type 3 design review, just to refresh folks' memory, requires a staff pre-application conference and then goes through the public hearing process with the Design Commission. There is a concern that this public process can interfere with the other public process that many of these agencies go through with stakeholders in developing bridges and the funding for those. There's also a concern about the timing of the review and land use appeals that can come up with these infrastructure projects. So an alternative that is supported by PBOT is to exempt bridges from the design overlay zone, but be clear that a bridge that has a span of over 100 feet be required to submit for a design advice request, which is a preliminary briefing with the Design Commission. It's a non-binding briefing, but that provides an opportunity for the Design Commission to make suggestions at a time earlier in the process where that information can then come back and potentially be adapted into the ultimate bridge design. We are looking for direction from the council on that. As you can see on the slide, the options are we can just keep the recommendation that the PSC forward, which is a type 3 review, or we can potentially propose this alternative option, or if the commissioners have any other ideas for alternatives, we'd be happy to discuss. And as Sandra mentioned, I do believe Courtney Duke from PBOT is here to answer any other questions specific to PBOT's process.
Bill, I think Commissioner Hardesty has a question for you.
Well, actually, thank you, Mayor, and thank you very much, Phil. And I'm sure maybe PBOT will have the answer. I thought that there had been a agreement kind of between the Bureau and Planning and Sustainability around like where the line would be. And you're sounding as if that's not the case.
Well, I don't know if Courtney will have anything to add on to this, but what I'm providing is the two options. The option is the PSC's recommendation. So, that is what we brought forward at the hearing. And then the second option is this alternative for the DAR. From a BPS standpoint, we don't have an issue with that second option. And I think Courtney can probably add some information about why it is that PBOT prefers this second option.
I can. Commissioner Rubio, would you like to ask first so I can maybe answer all together, or do you want me to go? I haven't been to council in a while, so you'll have to forgive me on protocols and stuff.
Well, this is all about this topic this afternoon, Courtney, and I think we should just take each person's questions separately.
That's fine.
Because I'm old, I won't remember what I asked.
No problem. Just double checking. Just want to make sure. So Commissioner Hardesty, thank you. Again, Courtney Duke. I'm a senior transportation planner representing the Bureau of Transportation. So we have been working as a staff at the staff level, Commissioner Hardesty, looking at the second option here, exempting bridges, but requiring design advice request. So your thought that, an agreement had been made or a conversation has been happening, we are doing that at the staff level for sure. But because it is a recommendation from Planning Commission to City Council, we do still have to have an amendment presented by you at some point, hopefully, to make that change. So from my perspective, from the staff perspective of PBOT, as well as our management perspective, this second option is what we've been discussing with the planning staff since it became proposed by Planning Commission. I can't even tell you the dates when all that was happening. But because it was their final recommendation to all of you, we do still have to do an official amendment process, no matter how much council or staff are in agreement with a change.
Thank you
Is
so
that
much.
helpful? Okay.
That is totally helpful, Courtney. You just fell right back into presenting at council mode. So you did a great job.
Thanks.
And thank you for the clarification, because yes, what I remember was, yes, there was just going to be this requirement and there was really no parameters around like what the bridge purpose was, who was paying for it, what other public processes were in place. And
Correct.
It sounds like PBOT and the Planning Commission had been trying to work around to see what would be a good compromise. And so thank you very much for
Sure.
that explanation. And I'm good.
Okay, great. I'll call on Commissioner Rubio, I guess. Is that okay, Mayor? Okay.
Now that's not your job, but I think we'll let you slide on that
Okay,
one. We're going to
thank
turn
you.
it back to
All
the
right.
mayor and he will
Okay.
take
Thank you.
control.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Rubio, go ahead.
Thank you, Courtney. I basically was going to raise some of the same points that you said about that our staff was working together, and it is indeed one and the same conversation, and that I just wanted to express support for continuing in that direction. I think we're making some really good progress there. So I would support that work continuing and hopefully turning into an amendment.
Great. So I can just give a couple of highlights for those who haven't been involved in the conversation, since not all of you have been there, as to the conversation that PBOT staff and management have been having with BPS staff and management. So just to reiterate and be clear, PBOT would like an amendment introduced that reflects language that was proposed in the original discussion draft, which requires a design advice request for any new bridges 100 feet or longer in design zones. That again is what was in the discussion draft, and that was changed at the Planning Commission, of which that meeting, there was not a PBOT staff member present to be able to have that conversation as well. So I'm just double checking my notes, sorry. So again, as Phil mentioned, and I appreciate Phil's intro, we have an extensive design and public review process built into all of our infrastructure projects as the steward and designer of the right-of-way. We also have a number of partners with bridges. A lot of the bridges that this may impact are actually not City of Portland bridges. They would be the county, ODOT, or TriMet, and they have not been fully briefed and involved in how this might work. And then just really a concern with the type 3 review as it can be moved up through the LUBA process in terms of appeals. And so much of the public infrastructure is on a different timeline and a different funding stream that we are using. So we have gone to Design Commission for design advice requests in the past, have gotten excellent advice, have strong connections with Design Commission. Many times the Design Commission has been a part of our public involvement process, and this just will allow us to really put them in at the right time as a part of our bigger public involvement and community engagement process when we do large infrastructure projects. I'll leave it at that for now.
Before I turn this over to Commissioner Mapps, I just want to be clear, when you say you're going to offer an amendment, my run of show here shows that there will be presentation on all of the proposed amendments as sort of our final action for this afternoon. So
correct.
We won't be doing anything with that right at the moment.
Correct. It's my understanding from Sandra that we'll have written amendments posted for the public to review on June 3rd, I believe. So we'll have time to work with the commissioners and staff to finalize the amendment language prior to that.
Good. Very good. Thank you. Commissioner Mapps and then Commissioner Hardesty.
Just a point of order question, Mayor. I thought when this item was announced, we said we were not doing amendments today.
We are not.
We're not.
We're not. So we're going to hear from staff today what recommendations they would have. And we're going to get my point was we're going to get a presentation at the end of all of their recommended technical amendments. Just to sort of preview where we're going to end this. We're going to open the written record. We'll come back, I believe, on June 10th to move and second amendments at that time. So we're not doing any of that today.
That's correct.
Commissioner Mapps, did you take your hand down because you're done, or you took it down because you're done?
Yeah, I think I'll ask my question another day.
Okay, Commissioner Ryan.
Thank you, Mayor. Perhaps I should ask mine another day, but here it goes. So here's where I'm confused. Everyone knows that, we love our bridges and the designs of bridges are really important. But when you mention the other jurisdictions, the county and the state and TriMet, so do they weigh in quite a bit on design review of bridges?
Well, it depends on the bridge. So the Tillicum Crossing was actually a TriMet bridge.
That's a TriMet, right?
And someone correct me if I'm not right, but the bridge itself was not considered part of the official design review through the code, but the ends of the bridge are because they were in design zones. It's similar to the Burnside Bridge. The Burnside Earthquake Ready Bridge, that's a county-led project. The ends of the bridge are technically in the design zone, but the bridge itself is not. So I know the Tillicum had extensive public process, both with the city and Design Commission, possibly Planning Commission. I wasn't involved in that project. The Earthquake Ready Bridge has had a briefing, I believe, even with City Council itself. So all of those have an extensive process and design review component as a part of their own project management process, I guess I'll say, as well as working with, again, going to get a design request, getting advice from Design Commission and other city bodies as they move through their construction process.
Each agency is going to be responsible for their specific bridge that they have control over. So we're probably looking at TriMet, ODOT for things that the interstate highways, PBOT for the streets, and Multnomah County for bridges over, I believe, the Willamette.
Correct.
So I mean, each of those agencies, generally follow their own, often extensive outreach process. We're going to start finding out again with the Columbia Crossing and ODOT on that process, even though most of that's not even in the D overlay. They're obviously going to go through an extensive public review process. So the question that was coming up when this got created was where does this city design review process slot into these larger infrastructure public processes? And I think the recommendation was that a DAR can easily slot in near the beginning of a process when the ideas and the design is being formulated. And it's also something that's probably more appealing to all the other agencies.
That was really helpful. Thank you, Phil. And thank you, Courtney. We all know that, Portlanders love their river and love the bridges, and didn't want to think that we were taking any action to not allow the public to weigh in that process. And I assumed that, but just reading it on paper, I just wanted to make sure I understood that, and maybe a couple people in the public were benefited from learning that just now as well. Thank you.
Great. So I think we could probably move on to the next subject, Mayor. Again, for that first one, we would need amendment from one of the commissioners. So we'll work with your offices to see who would like to sponsor that one. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you.
The next subject is about the makeup of the design commission itself. And Phil will lead us through this one too.
Okay, so you'll see on the slide, we've got a couple columns here. And I'm going to go over this real briefly, but the Design Commission is made up of 7 volunteers total. As part of DOZA, we did not propose to change that overall number, but over the proposed and recommended drafts, there have been changes proposed within that makeup of 7 people. Initially, staff proposed expanding the list of the expert fields as shown to include the urban planning, architecture, and landscape architecture fields. We also further clarified who could be a public at large member with the intent that the public at large member not also just be a person working in that industry and is truly somebody that can create an outside perspective. During the PSC discussions, there were several PSC members that recognize that our design guidelines and design standards, which wouldn't necessarily have an impact on the commission, but our design guidelines were expanding beyond just architecture of a building and starting to look at sustainable building practices, looking at the relationship of the building and its environment. And as a result of that, the PSC made the recommendation that 2 of the 5 members that were pulled from the subject experts, that 2 of those members would be pulled out and that there'd be dedicated subject experts in sustainable building practices and natural resource management on the commission. And then the other subject experts would pull and create 3 additional members. This was done, as I mentioned, to kind of address the added influence of sustainable building practices and natural systems. So there's also been some testimony that you may have read about the role of those who advocate or have lived experience with affordable housing. That's not shown here at all as far as a dedicated person, but I do want to point out that such a person as an affordable housing advocate could represent the public at large in its current status. So the question we have here is, the DOZA proposal is what the Planning and Sustainability Commission made the recommendation to revamp the makeup of the Design Commission. So the question we have is whether that allocation is reasonable, or if there is a concern on the council's point about whether specifying certain subject experts to single subject experts may make it difficult to fill those positions in the future. And if the council feels that that's the case, then we would be looking to see if the council members want to suggest an amendment to potentially tweak that further or not. One of the things that was discussed is whether the natural resource management and sustainable building practice experts could just be lumped in with the subject experts and keep that as a number of 5. So with that, I'm going to open it up for discussions.
Very good. You have questions from both Commissioners Hardesty and Rubio in that order, please.
I remember us also having a conversation around the more we identify specific seats, the less diverse this commission will be. And I didn't hear your perspective on what did you do with that information and how is that informing what you're thinking today?
Well, I think it's a tough question because it depends on how one would look at, if it's subject diversity or expertise.
I'm actually talking, I want to be clear, I'm talking racial and ethnic diversity. Because if you're recruiting based on a expertise that traditionally has been led by white men, then chances are you're going to recruit white men to serve on this design commission. I'm not saying that's what you do, but I'm just saying the more distinctive roles are, unless you're intentional. We have some committees that actually could fill this with all people of color, but it depends on how the recruitment is done and who you reach out to. So I didn't hear how you were taking racial and ethnic diversity as well as lived experience into account when you're recruiting for new members.
Well, I think it's a combination of things, Commissioner Hardesty. What's on the right column is what the Planning and Sustainability Commission is recommending. We have, I think, at the city some experience with different committees that have more general membership requirements, like the Planning and Sustainability Commission, for example, versus committees that are required to have specific slots filled. So, for example, the Development Review Advisory Committee that gives advice to BDS has very specific recruitments. Phil represents us on that committee and was observing that they still have a vacancy of at least 7 positions, because sometimes it's hard to find somebody who specifically is a natural resource management expert. And as far as like ethnic and racial diversity, I think my perspective is that it probably makes it even more difficult. I staff the Planning and Sustainability Commission. When we do our recruitments, we go far and wide. We try to do a lot of recruitment in East Portland because that has been traditionally really hard to get folks from East Portland to dedicate this many hours, partially maybe because our meetings are held downtown and it takes an hour to come in the evenings, and it's a huge commitment. We also have a hard time getting parents to volunteer because we aren't necessarily offering daycare. So I think we have one commission member who has children, and of course that puts an extra burden on his partner to step up to the plate while he's participating. I think across
a great time for us to, as we're looking at how we recruit, support, champion community volunteers who are volunteering a lot of hours to advise and encourage the city to do the right thing. I think we have to think differently about who we serve and how we get to serve them and how we remove the barriers so that they can participate. Because this sounds a lot, let me just say that I think we have many opportunities, and I've seen us do it really excellent. We've recruited folks very recently on what was the one of the committees associated with the Design Commission. Very diverse group of people, but if we're not intentional, what I have seen is that we don't have diversity on these commissions and these boards. And it doesn't happen accidentally. It happens because we're intentionally about how do we make sure this is reflecting the community.
Right. And one of the things I heard Planning Commissioner Kat Schultz express about her support for these 2 extra positions for natural resource management and sustainable building practices is that it guarantees that those voices are represented on the Design Commission, as opposed to, say, a full membership on the Design Commission of architects or designers who are trained in design and have a certain way of thinking about the built environment. So for that reason, she was supportive of having specific slots to guarantee that those perspectives were included.
Okay, thank you, Sandra. Let me just say that if that limits our ability to have diversity represented on the committee, I would not support that move.
I think one of the issues that comes up with all these subject experts is the fact that oftentimes, some of these expert fields are not diverse. That there's one can look at architects and planners and see a much lower percentage of BIPOC individuals that are within these fields than within the general population. So that can be problematic just as an underlying feature. I think there's selection opportunities when selecting the commission that maybe aren't stated in zoning code, but are part of the selection process that can help overcome some of those barriers. I think that the thing you bring up, Commissioner Hardesty, about, if you have somebody who's just a natural resource expert, as opposed to having a pool of people that you can pull from, you can potentially reduce the pool of individuals that you can select from to fill these different positions. I think DRAC, and I think actually DRAC only has 3 vacancies now, but DRAC had considerable number of vacancies because each position was from a specific kind of field of interest. And that can sometimes make it hard to find willing and qualified candidates for. And so the more you kind of separate out the fields, that sometimes the harder it can be to find people that are willing and
right. Thanks, Bill. Yeah, thank you, Commissioner Hardesty, for those observations too.
Commissioner Rubio, then Commissioner Ryan.
Thank you. I want to say that I really appreciate the intent of what the Planning Commission was trying to do here by raising these specific areas to ensure, that lens is represented. I do have concerns in personal experience with these kinds of seats tied to slots, and also just in some of the examples you just gave too, that there are still some that remain open. So I'm wondering if for just moving forward, if there's a way to explore still getting at the same, intent or outcome, but maybe having a different mechanism, or I'm sure you've looked at this, but if there are ways to continue talking about that, I would love to see that. My actual question is really about the regional arts and culture member. Just for clarity, I'm just interested, does that mean a staff, or does that mean a board member or an artist that's working with RAC? Just for my own clarity.
Boy, I don't have it off the top of my head. I believe I don't think it's a staff. I think it's somebody who serves on the Regional Arts and Culture Commission.
And Stacy Monroe is here from BDS and works closely with the commission. Stacy, can you enlighten us?
Correct. It actually is a board member. I think it's a 9-panel board that this member also participates on in conjunction with their design review membership.
And this is something that's been a part of the Design Commission's makeup for 25, 30 years. I mean, it predates RAC. It was actually part of the Metropolitan Art and whatever Commission. The previous name of that commission was. So that was one situation where we didn't necessarily reanalyze the reason for it. We did reach out to RAC and just talk about it, and they felt that both RAC and the Design Commission members felt there was a real benefit of having somebody with that perspective on the commission.
Thank you.
Commissioner Ryan.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I want to say I'm glad we're having this conversation. Another thing I want to mention is that Commissioner Hardesty, you mentioned the group that recently came to the council that you were impressed with the diversity. That was actually DRAC. And I worked my tail off to recruit people, and that's what it takes, of course, to get the type of inclusion you want. So we can never underestimate the what really goes on in terms of inclusion work. So just want to get that on the record. And now moving on to this specific topic, I'm really in line with what I've been hearing from my last 2 colleagues. I think that you never want to compromise lived experience or diversity of inclusion in any commission. I've had too many experiences where it does become more challenging when you target these specific skill sets. I also think that there's an opportunity to consider adding natural resource sustainability building practices into what is number of the 5 members over here. We have the other skill sets that you want, so just make that broad. But at this moment, I'm not leaning towards the current recommendation, and I wanted to put that on record. Yeah.
Thank you, Commissioner Ryan.
Thank you for sharing that. So again, if we want to change this, we'd be looking for one of you commissioners to make an amendment for that. I think we heard some feedback about how we could do that. So we'll be in contact with your offices and with you over the next week.
One thing I do want to just mention related to the current 5 members that are from this list of folks that is getting dwindled down to 3 as of the proposal. One thing I do want to mention with the code that helps remove the possibility of stacking it all with architects is our current code does state that no more than 2 members may be appointed from any one of these areas of expertise. So kind of getting at Commissioner Ryan's idea, if you add to the pool of experts and keep that code provision in that no more than 2 from any one subject can serve, that helps to, from a subject standpoint, create a more diverse pool.
Yeah, so we'll keep working on that and bring it back to your offices. Thank you. Let's go ahead and move on to our 3rd subject, which is the inner Main Street design. Commissioner Hardesty.
Just before you move on, I just want to be really clear. I think the work that Commissioner Ryan did around what was the name of that? The
DRAC, the
DRAC?
Development Review Advisory
DRAC,
Committee.
yeah.
Mhm.
was intentional, right? I mean, and I asked earlier and I didn't get an answer about, so where do you recruit, right? The mayor just created a partnership with all the minority chambers. I suspect the minority chambers would have access to professionals from the fields that you're recruiting for, right? What's the relationships that you have with those communities? It's not just when you have an opening. And so I just wanted to not leave this without reinforcing what Commissioner Ryan said, which is when we're intentional, when we know we have openings coming up, we have the opportunity to build relationships with folks who will advocate on our behalf. But if we just think that once we have an opening, that we can just go and fill it and then tell ourselves it's okay because of very few Black and brown people in these fields, that's not acceptable anymore at the city of Portland. So I just want us to be challenging ourselves to think outside of what we are accustomed to doing when we are filling boards and commissions at the city of Portland. I think this is an opportunity for us to, again, just think differently, act differently, engage differently with a much broader community.
Well said. Thank you, Commissioner Hardesty. So we're shifting gears, and Laura Lillard is going to lead us through our 3rd subject, which is about inner Main Street design standards.
Good afternoon, commissioners. As Phil mentioned, we received a lot of testimony about the specific design features along inner Main Streets from folks supporting the Sellwood Moreland Improvement League, or SMILE, and PDX Main Streets, and we were asked to take a closer look. So we're hoping to just shed some light on what some of those design features are. And there's actually a specific ask to require a standard where applicants pick from a menu of design features along inner Main Streets only. So let's first look at where that might apply. And next slide. The idea is that a standard would apply to small concentrated areas focusing on the inner Main Streets that were platted and developed with the early streetcar and have historic pockets of buildings which have specific design characteristics. So just to get oriented to this map, the map shows in yellow areas with design overlay. And you see the Central City and Gateway on this map are in blue. Those also have de-overlay, but this amendment doesn't apply to those. I just wanted to point them out to help you get oriented. The comprehensive plan identifies 5 pattern areas, which are based on distinct characteristics that are influenced by the natural environment and topography, but also how and where these parts of the city were developed. So it calls out the western, eastern, inner neighborhoods, as well as the Central City and the rivers and industrial pattern areas. So just to focus on that middle gray, this is the inner pattern area, and it's kind of moves from Central City east to I-205, but it also includes pockets in North Portland and Macadam. And this was an area that was platted and developed during the streetcar era of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. All of the centers, the rough location for all of the centers in the city are shown in circles. And these all have a center's Main Street overlay, and that was already brought up earlier by Phil. This is also known as the M overlay. And once again, DOZA does not change the M overlay at all. The M overlay is shown in the orange hatch. Not all of the centers have D overlay, so some of the M overlay doesn't sit on top of the D overlay. So you'll see orange hatch where there's not yellow. And the only reason I'm pointing all of these out to you is because where you have both is where we're talking about this standard may be applying in the inner neighborhoods. The M overlay is applied to what we sometimes call the center of centers because it encourages ground floor shops and services near transit. So the new standard that we've been asked to explore would apply to that orange hatch, the center's Main Street overlay, of the areas that are in yellow, which is the D overlay, in the inner Main Street, which is that center middle gray. So the new standard that we've been asked to explore is typical of a new design standard proposed in DOZA, where it has a menu approach and requires an applicant to pick one, but encourages them to pick more than one by earning points for more than one feature. And these are the 6 features that actually came up in Smile's testimony. And I'll go over these features in the next slides. So I'm using recently built projects to illustrate the features. This idea of base, middle, top distinguishes these 3 layers of the building architecturally with a cornice or a shift in materials to distinguish between each of those layers. The upper level step back is this notion that after a certain height, the upper portion of the building steps back to allow more light and air. And then the third one on this slide is the angled corner entries, which is sometimes called out as a chamfered corner. It refers to the building not meeting the corner of an intersection at a point, but more like a 45-degree angle with an entry facing an intersection. Clerestory or transom windows are the windows directly above doors and windows on the ground floors. And then stacked vertical windows just is about, aligning the windows on the upper floors, and that they're vertical just means they're taller than they are wide. And finally, the 6th feature is extended balconies, meaning that they project out rather than recess into the building. So these are the 6 features that were called out. And the idea is that a new standard would require new buildings on sites, again, that have the M overlay and that are using design standards to pick one of these 6 features and then potentially earn points for picking more than one feature. So we were asked to explore this and just wanted to point out what that looks like and what those mean. And that's all I have on this particular piece.
Thanks, Laura. And I moved us back a few slides just so you could see the list of features that Laura used the subsequent slides to illustrate.
Commissioner Max.
I just want to thank staff for looking into this particular issue. I certainly appreciate the benefits of universal urban design. At the same time, Portland is a city of neighborhoods, and preserving some of the unique elements of our classic small business districts makes sense to me. I don't believe that we should, place our classic neighborhoods in amber and not let them change. And it seems to me like we're moving in a direction here that allows us to build upon our classic walkable, street-friendly neighborhoods while preserving their characters, but also allowing us to stretch into the future. So I'm interested to see where this goes.
Commissioner Ryan.
Yes, thank you. Could you go back to the map that has the circles in the orange and?
Oops, sorry. There you go.
Yeah, that one. So here's what I think right now. I think that having a great pedestrian experience for the first couple of floors where you have retail and I can't remember the windows now. But my point is, I live in Arbor Lodge, so now I get why I'm confused, what's happening here. So I'm in the yellow section without the orange. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That means that, so there's big buildings going up, and then the pedestrians in my neighborhood, and I would be one of them, and even if I wasn't on city council, I'd be wondering about this. So I'm wondering why some of these buildings are going up and there's no, on the pedestrian level, there isn't retail with all of them. And so, we had a famous bowling alley go out, and then a 5-story dense, wonderful building, and we're so close to transit, right? There's the Max there. So I think people in my neighborhood, I'm feeling like a real neighborhood person at this moment because it's like 2 blocks away, are wondering why there isn't such codes and why we don't have that same retail experience that you would just a few blocks to the south there at Killingsworth, or a few blocks to the north when you get down to Lombard. So we're in this in-between zone. And there's some other buildings that are projected to go up. And I think increasingly, if these go up and we have more density housing near transit, good thing. Why can't we also have, like in other big cities I've lived in, having retail there as well?
Mm-hmm. When I can just speak to the M overlay, when the M overlay, which is that Main Streets overlay that requires retail and services at the ground floor, but it can also be daycare and other community services. It doesn't necessarily have to be shops. When that was mapped out, it was only mapped within the designated centers. And so that's why I mentioned it's the center of the centers. We were trying to be very specific and intentional about where that is, where we require retail because we didn't want to oversaturate. In those areas where there is mixed use zoning, ground floor retail is allowed. And so at that point, it's a market driven decision. Now, I will say that design overlay in all of the area in yellow, because we've heard from many folks that say, we have mixed use zoning, but we see apartments going up and we see ground floor residential instead of retail, and we'd like retail. We have included a standard that is one of those options where you achieve points for putting in ground floor retail. And we've also incentivized affordable commercial as well on top of that. So we are trying to encourage more of that, but you are correct in saying that it is not required because it's not shown in the M overlay. It's not in the M overlay.
And
So
can I just share another piece of that conversation was happening during the comprehensive plan. When we were updating the mixed use zones in the comprehensive plan, there was a big discussion about why aren't we requiring ground floor retail for all of these commercial zones regardless? Then you wouldn't even have to have the M overlay because it's just in the base zone. Our analysis showed that we didn't have enough market for that much retail space. And so if we were requiring buildings to be built with a ground floor retail space, our fear was that it would sit vacant because we didn't have the market for it, because we just don't have the density for it in some of these areas. So that's why when Laura says it was left up to the market to decide, that was the ultimate conclusion from that conversation.
Okay, so I'm just advocating for perhaps more M overlay on the yellow line and along interstate. Am I getting too micro? We're just having a conversation, but I just want to put that out, that I think it seems a little short-sighted that we don't include more M overlay perhaps in these, what I think are actually very densely populated and will be more populated as we go forward. So yeah, I just wanted to advocate for that.
Okay, so we might work with your office on that one. You're thinking we might actually have to amend the comprehensive plan, which gives us the recipe of where the M overlay would be provided. So that's probably, it's a bigger lift than we anticipated with these DOZA amendments. But we can continue the conversation in the next day or two.
And I realize when I'm advocating for something that I have a lot of current experience with my own eyes, but I realize there's probably other parts of this plan where maybe we need to take a breath and see where we can expand the M overlay. If we're really moving more towards densely populated neighborhoods near transit, really making sure we're not missing any of those neighborhoods that are continuing to become more of a place where you can live, work, and be. And it really is part of the climate crisis too, right? To have more people in places that they can take care of their footprint near their home. So.
And just a reminder also, those conversations that happened with the comprehensive plan, they just went into effect in 2018. So what we're seeing in the city being built and the new buildings that you're seeing right now is not a result of the new rules that have gone into place. They were already projects that were in the works before the new rules went into place. I think there's a lot to be said for maybe waiting on this idea for a few years to see how our new mixed-use zones really start playing out.
Yeah.
Especially since we haven't done very much outreach about the M overlay zone.
Sure.
We're concentrating on the D overlay zone.
No, this is helpful. I appreciate the dialogue. I'm learning at this moment. So I appreciate this dialogue. Thank you, Sandra. Yeah.
Thank you.
Commissioner Rubio, then Commissioner Hardesty.
Thank you. I too just wanted to express an interest in seeing where that conversation with Commissioner Ryan's office goes around the M overlay in particular. I'm learning as well. My question is more about with these particular set of concepts that have been proposed. Has there been an analysis about cost when we're looking at affordable housing developments and some of the requirements to choose? Does it demand some of the requirements that you get to choose among? Are they significant things that would add additional cost to those developments?
I think that one of the benefits of having a pick one is that it wouldn't be forcing somebody to do something that they don't want to do, that doesn't support the design of their building, that's just adding costs for nothing, but just a requirement. So that's nice. I know there's been a lot of dialogue with the neighborhoods about this notion of stacking windows being something that is an affordability issue, lining up your floor plates and your windows so that everything's stacked, decreases cost. So you're not having to redesign a new floor plate. I know that the upper level step backs, on the other hand, that is a different floor plate because you're having to push your building back. And so that is something that would probably be more expensive to do. But again, I think the idea that this would be a pick one is helpful in that regard. So we haven't done a breakdown of each of these features in terms of the cost. If it's just a matter of changing materials at the base or at the top in order to make that distinction, I don't think that's going to add a lot of significant cost. But we can look into that a little bit more if you'd like.
Yeah, I would appreciate knowing what that would look like. So thank you.
Very good. Commissioner Hardesty.
Thank you, Mayor. And I got to tell you, I'm loving this conversation. As folks may know, the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability released a report last year that talked about the racist impact of historic land use policy in the city of Portland. And just a couple of weeks ago, we found out that Black folks are a cost burden in attempting to live, have housing within the city of Portland. When I see proposals move forward that say we want to maintain the culture of our Main Street, it just sends off all kind of danger signs in my head. And so, and we've changed a lot, I hope, and the time that we've had here in the Portland metro area. So how would this actually embrace the cultural and racial diversity that exists in our city? And with actually creating these cookie cutter approaches actually prevent creativity opportunity for communities who weren't part of what that picture looks like today.
Yeah, thank you for your comment. This is one of the reasons why we were really reticent in the beginning to propose anything like this that was so specific about a particular time period and about a particular style. And we were really focused on, what does the built environment say about the design for people and how to create welcoming spaces that don't necessarily look at specific design features, and just wanting to be more inclusive. Everything that is on this list is certainly allowed in our current design standards and guidelines. But I think the feedback that we got and that we were asked to explore was, what if you just, were a little bit more proactive about calling them out and requiring one. So I definitely hear you. And I feel like that's a trade-off and something that we need to think more about. So I'd love to hear more about kind of what your thinking is, because I know that that's what we struggled with, which is why we had sort of stayed away from an approach like this.
Yeah, I know that is a question that we're dealing with all over the city of Portland at the moment, right? It's like, Northeast does not look like it did when I moved in 35 years ago, 32 years ago. And it's not going to look that way, I guess, in another 20 years. But it is important that we don't continue the mistakes of the past. And what we know is that land use decisions that we made really made opportunities available for some people at the expense of others. And so I would be reluctant to make a change that gave points for continuing a status quo existence that wasn't inclusive of all voices. Sandra looks perplexed. And that's, your own data shows what impact land use laws has had on the economic prosperity of Black and Brown people in this community, right? So, I'm not willing to actually entertain reinforcing bad land use policy that didn't allow Black and Brown people to be able to prosper. So when we mandate just, even in a design, right, that, if you pick one of these, you get extra points. That just makes me a little, really uncomfortable. Not a little, a lot uncomfortable. And unless you've done the research to show that this will not have racially disparate outcomes, I would not be able to support a proposal like this. So that's where I am.
Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Mapps, and I just want to give a heads up, folks. We're over an hour in and we've not completed section 2 out of 6 so far, just to give you that heads up.
Is it our fault? This is interesting.
No, it's their fault. They're giving us a good presentation. Yeah, no, it is. And Commissioner Hardesty, just a heads up, in about 5 minutes, I'm going to turn the gavel over to you. I'll still be listening in, but I will not be able to preside. And so I'll turn it over to you for about a half an hour-ish or so in about 5 minutes, and I'll let you know when that is. Commissioner Mapps.
I wanted to say that I both share Commissioner Hardesty's concern about land use policies that discriminate against people of color. At the same time, I think what we're trying to do with this particular proposal is preserve not the racial characteristics of these particular neighborhoods, but preserve this a feeling or quality of these neighborhoods, which makes them kind of walkable, neighborhood friendly. We kind of think about complete neighborhoods where you have commercial stuff on the front, on the first floor that just makes it very accessible. And I think that that's what these proposals are trying to get at, or at least in my ideal world, that's what amendments like this would look like. But we can explore this. I don't need to go deeper into this. I know we need to go into other issues, but of course I don't want to cut anyone off should they want to.
We're ready to move on? Is that right? Okay, thank you very much. So I'm gonna fast forward through these and we are on subject number 4. And just the time check that Commissioner Wheeler just mentioned, we do have an hour left. Subject number 5, the 55 versus 75 foot height limit is probably going to take a considerable amount of time. The technical amendments probably won't at all, probably 5 minutes at the end. So just to give you a rough estimate of how we should spend our next hour. So this next subject is about how affordable housing projects should be reviewed, and Phil will give the intro.
Thanks, Sandra. So before we go over the different options, I do want to mention, before getting into this question, to point out that the undergoing design review would be subject to the same approval criteria, regardless of if something went through a type 2 review or a type 3 review. So the question that's at stake here has more to do with process and maybe to a lesser extent with the fees involved in that review process. So one of the things that we heard a fair amount of testimony about our provision that allows certain affordable housing projects that would normally be subject to a type 3 design review to elect to go through a type 2 design review. This current proposal, which is actually similar to the housing emergency standard that was developed 5 years ago, it allows a project receiving a city subsidy and providing at least 20% of its units at 60% or below MFI to choose a type 2 design review, which involves a staff review and decision in situations that would normally trigger a type 3 review, which is a review that goes through design commission. As I mentioned, there was testimony to consider maybe allowing other forms of affordable housing to take advantage of this process change. Part of the balancing act is to potentially expand the opportunity, but still provide the oversight we need so that the housing is built as intended with the affordable units intact. We do have some other possible options here. Jesse Connor is also here from the Housing Bureau to help with the discussion. So to go over some of these other options, we could keep the staff proposal, which is the city subsidy project. One thing that was discussed in a little bit with the Housing Bureau and internally was considering using the SDC threshold trigger that was developed for the Equal Opportunities for Affordable Housing project. That basically applies and when there's at least 50% of the units apply for the waiver at 60% MFI. Both these and the city subsidy project require that the housing be affordable for 60 years. There was also some testimony and some discussion about potentially using some sort of a tax credit or tax exemption program and having those projects be allowable to use the type 2 review if they would normally go through type 3. This can be a little bit problematic because a lot of times those programs are administered by state or other agencies and aren't always overseen by the Housing Bureau. The last bullet I wanted to just put up there was whether there's any interest in basically assigning this to all projects that meet our inclusionary housing proposal, which currently is in the central city and gateway is 10% of the units at 60% MFI or 20% of the units at 80%. And then outside the central city, it's even a lower percentage. There's a concern with using this approach and automatically granting every project that would meet this, our IH provision, because there's already a lot of bonuses in floor area and height that are given to these projects. This is also a project that probably would benefit from having an assessment done of its success since it's been implemented for just a few years. It's not certain that this idea of going from a type 3 to a type 2 would be that much of a benefit for those projects, especially in comparison to the height and floor area bonuses that they have. So we actually discussed this a little bit with the Housing Bureau yesterday.
So excuse me, Phil, I'm going to cut you off for a sec, and I'm going to answer your question. Your question about the inclusionary housing. We have passed a budget note that we will be doing a evaluation of that program in the next fiscal year. So in answer to your question, yes, there will be an evaluation of whether it's doing what we intended.
Well, that's great, because I think we'd be interested in finding out about that, because there is a lot of conversations related to that. But I think our sense was of these 4 bullets, the first 2 bullets are the best for potential oversight. As I mentioned, the first bullet is actually what is in the recommended draft. I think if there's an interest in expanding above the city subsidy projects, which are literally projects that are gaining funds from the city, we did successfully create an option for the Equal Opportunities for Affordable Housing that assigns projects that are using the SDC waiver. That's also a provision in Title 30, and we thought that would be another option that may open the door some to have other affordable housing projects be able to take advantage of a type 2 review if there would normally be a type 3. So those are kind of the 2, I think, options we felt were the best. But I'd welcome to hear, direction or comments from the City Commission on that.
Does that complete your presentation on this part?
Yes.
All right. I'm sure people might have questions. Commissioner Hardesty, at this point, I will continue to monitor, but I'll be turning the gavel over to you.
Okay, Mayor, thank you.
Thank you.
Colleagues, questions on this part, on this amendment recommendation? Not seeing any hands up. I see Commissioner Ryan. Commissioner Ryan.
You can go first. I'm trying to collect my thoughts here.
Okay. Well, what I was going to say is I certainly don't think recommendations 3 or 4 would be something that I would consider. I won't speak for anyone else. And I'm much more interested in, yes, could we speed up the, whether it's at 60% MFI in my mind is really housing people can afford to live in. And I am very interested in what it would look like if we were able to have them go through a design, a type 3 rather than a type 2 rather than the type 3 design review. Did I mess that up, Phil? And you're trying to figure out what
I'm trying to, yeah. Are you asking about what the difference in the process would be?
So my question is like, how does that expedite, I guess, housing at 60% of MFI?
So it's expedites it in the sense that a type 2 process has a shorter timeline. It does not require a pre-application conference ahead of time, and does not go through the design commission and a public hearing. It has public notice and a staff decision. So there is a shorter timeline. There is a little bit less fees. At least the maximum amount of fees that can be charged is lower for a type 2 than for a type 3. So essentially, and what we were proposing was that the applicant have the choice. So the housing provider could decide, I want to go and have the design commission weigh in on this, or I really, want suggestions from that design commission. They may actually still choose to go to the type 3. There may be other housing providers who feel comfortable and confident that they are meeting the criteria and are willing to just work directly with staff to get to the decision and feel that that's a quicker process. So it's really more of a flexibility thing than anything.
And I have one more question. So let's say that we made no changes to current law. Nothing now would prevent a affordable housing provider seeking advice, even if it wasn't necessary under current law.
If somebody, and you're talking about seeking advice before they formally approve. So currently, and our proposal allows a design advice request to be requested for any project that's going through a design review. So it's not required, but it's something that is allowed, and anybody who wants to seek advice before they formally apply for either a design review or for a historic review can go through this DAR process.
Thank you. Commissioner Ryan.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner Hardesty. So an affordable housing project can choose between 2 or type 3, right? That's what you were just saying. They have that choice.
Right, and the housing emergency actually created a very specific review. The housing emergency created a type 2X review that they could choose to go through if they went through a DAR. So it created this kind of hybrid review. We backed off of that with DOZA and said, let's not have its own review. So our proposal kept the city subsidy project threshold at the 60 at 20% units at 60% MFI, but we basically said that project, if they're getting funding from the city, can choose to go to a type 2 review if they would normally be big enough that they would trigger a type 3. And what we're sort of asking is, based upon the testimony, based on what some folks have asked about, is there another threshold besides city subsidy that may provide more opportunity for other affordable housing projects to have that choice between the type 2 and type 3? And I think the thing that we latched on a little bit was this other idea of the SDC waiver program.
Okay. Anyway, I think what I'm thinking, I think everyone is there. No, I should speak for everyone. I'm thinking right now that we want to expedite the process for our our affordable housing providers, but we also don't want the public to go, oh, that's an affordable housing unit that doesn't look as nice as the other ones. So it's that, and I think that the standards are getting us there, but I think the fact that we allow maybe there's a compromise that we're working out here of some sort where we require type 2 with design advice request and formal early assistance meeting. Yeah, did that make any sense?
The thing to keep in mind is, so the type 2 it's a staff level review, but the approval criteria, the design guidelines for a type 2 and a type 3 are identical. So then the question is more of a subjective question of, does the design commission as a volunteer body of people bring those guidelines up to a higher bar than a staff planner who's reviewing that project for those same guidelines. And to me, that's a subjective question. I think,
And our philosophy during this project was we shouldn't have different bars. There shouldn't be that a project goes through standards and we see this level of quality, and that a project goes through type 2 and it's a bit higher, and then the bar is even higher for design commission. What we were really working on is that all three, whichever process you go through, we come out with the same outcome of quality urban environment. I think you've heard in the testimony from the design commission that they don't think we quite hit that. The planning commission definitely thinks that we did, and that kind of leads into our next conversation about that height threshold. But that's what the discrepancy between the two is. But Phil's right, it's the same approval criteria. So do you think a group of 7 people can make a better decision because there's a public hearing and 7 people are collaborating on a design versus the staff planner who's interacting directly with the applicant?
All right, Sandra, that was very helpful. On the last bullet, I want to concur with what I heard from my Commissioner Hardesty, and that is this should not be consideration for affordable housing in getting a different kind of design review. And we do really need to do that study. So I think that there's no need for that. That's my opinion on that. I think we have to define affordable housing better here. Currently, DOZA affordable housing is just defined as city subsidized projects. So they receive Portland Housing Bureau funding, correct?
Correct.
Okay, with at least 20% of the units at or below 60% AMI. So if in fact this, there's a lot of, there's funds coming in. And if you read what the economic forecast is for the state of Oregon, there's a lot of money coming from the state. So there's a chance that we could get some wonderful affordable housing opportunities that come directly from the state, and maybe even HUD. But my point is, we won't always, it doesn't always have to be Portland Housing Bureau. And so we need to shake up that definition a bit in order to move forward. I love that I see people nodding their head right now. So anyway, wanted to put that out. I'll quit while I'm ahead. All right. I'll get into the weeds now and I won't even make sense to myself.
So it might be worthwhile. It might be worthwhile to check with Jessie Connor with the Housing Bureau, because she may be able to shed a little light too on the program for the SDC waivers. Because once again, it's a program that isn't giving folks a direct subsidy in the terms of funding, but it does waive SDC requirements. And so I think there's a possibility that these projects that can't get other funding from other sources would still potentially apply for the SDC waiver. And if
Excuse me, Phil, I'm going to cut you off and allow Commissioner Maps to ask this question or make his statement, because I do know the next question is going to take probably the bulk of the time that we have left, so I want to be mindful of the time. So, Commissioner Maps.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner Hardesty. I just wanted to lay my cards on the table in terms of the piece I'm most interested in here. I don't know what's going to happen. I've heard strong testimony over the virtues of allowing folks to go through type 2 review. I've also heard strong testimony about the strengths of going through type 3 review. I've talked to affordable housing builders, some of whom are eager to opt into the type 2. I've talked to other affordable housing providers who say they would choose, even if they had the type 2 option, they would still go through the type 3 review because of the value added from getting that advice. I don't think I have enough information to know what will happen in the real world, which is one of the things I like about the design of this program. I'd like to offer affordable housing folks the option to either do type 2 or type 3. I think in short order, we'll have some real world examples of the type of affordable housing that gets produced. And I'm awfully curious to see that if indeed will this type of housing be indistinguishable from one another, which would be interesting, or we might see some real differences. So, and I know we've had a lot of important discussions about other subtleties, but I think that's the sort of experiment in nature that I'm looking forward to. Thank you, Madam Commissioner.
Thank you. So that's the feedback from council so far. I guess we should move on to the next one if there are no additional questions here. Let's go to number 5.
Great, thank you, Commissioner. So number 5, we're back to Laura, and this is about the height threshold for design review.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll try to be brief so we can have some time for discussion. So we were asked to give some context about the height threshold for design review. And we're going to see a repeat of a slide that we showed 2 weeks ago that hopefully you'll remember. Next slide. And it's the framework for who reviews what and when. We're going to focus on the middle row. This is referred to as the 2-track system. So if you recall, if a project is not exempt, such as a large alteration or a new building, an applicant has a choice. And on the left side is a design plan check where approval is granted as part of an application for a building permit. So it's faster and it involves less public input. The regulations for this track are called standards, and they are clear and objective, and you either meet them or you don't. They're quantifiable. An example would be like a building must include one of 6 design features. That's an example that we just talked about. If an applicant can't meet the standards, or if the building is too big, or an applicant would like more flexibility than the standards offer, they don't want to meet the standards, then an applicant can go through the design review track. And design review uses discretion. And depending on the size of the project, as we've been discussing, the decision maker is either design commission or staff. So for all design reviews, the approval criteria is called guidelines, and they are qualitative, like design your ground floor so that it responds to the context of an adjacent historic building. Today, right now, the threshold for projects that can meet the clear and objective standards is 55 feet, which is around 5 stories. And above that, you would need to go through design review. DOZA raises that threshold to 75 feet if you're not in Central City or Gateway. And we just have some real life examples of what the difference in scale between 55 feet and 75 feet is. So the building on the left is a built project in the Central City. It's around 6 stories with tall floors. It's about 75 feet. I didn't go out and measure it, but this is kind of an estimate. And then on the right are examples of buildings that are around 55 feet. The top example, just the corner, is 5 stories. And then you can kind of see it stepping down to 4 stories and then even 3 stories. So just to get a flavor of those buildings. Commissioners were curious how that would affect the reviews. So I just wanted to share this table. It was created in 2016 when we started the assessment. So the data is a little bit old now. It shows all of the projects built in the design overlay over the previous 3 years. So new construction is shown in orange, alterations are in light blue, and additions in floor area are shown in that darker blue. So I'll just draw your attention to the red circle, and that's where we have that 2-track system, like I was talking about, for areas outside of Central City and Gateway. And again, that threshold is 55 feet today. About half of the projects we found went through design review and half used standards. Again, the reasons are because an applicant can't meet or doesn't want to meet the standards, and then if they have a building taller than 55 feet. And we didn't break that down, but you can see that about half go through design review and half don't. Next slide. Commissioners were also curious where this change matters on the ground. So this map shows the geographies in play. And again, we're looking at the design overlay zones, which on this map, they're hatched. And in yellow are all of the areas that are zoned with maximum heights less than 55 feet. So these areas would have the option to use design standards today. And in DOZA, that doesn't change. On the upper level, the areas in red at the high end are zoned with the max heights taller than 75 feet. And so these areas, if they are built to their max heights, would be required to go through design review today. And again, DOZA doesn't change that. So sort of those are that bookends. So if you look at the areas in blue, these are the areas that are zoned with max heights between 55 feet and 75 feet. And these are the areas in play right now. So today, these areas would be required to go through design review. The DOZA proposal is that the new threshold of 75 feet would allow them to use design standards instead. So those are the areas that we're really talking about. And then the last slide.
Sorry, I was just going to ask, are there any questions about this map before Laura shares kind of the pros and con arguments that we've heard?
And we can always go back to it.
We can come back to it.
So we just finally.
I'm not seeing any questions. Thank you.
Okay. Sorry. I'm just trying to be as brief as possible. We wanted to, again, excuse me, reiterate PSC's reasoning for raising the threshold to 75 feet, but also just summarize some of the testimony that we've heard for and against increasing the threshold. So, again, many of the base zones allow buildings taller than 55 feet. DOZA has modeled the design standards after the design outcomes in design review. So we are trying to provide some parity between the two processes. Also for design standards, DOZA added more required standards and points to buildings that are taller than 55 feet. But on the other hand, many of the testifiers against the new threshold have said that design review really allows for that public testimony, whereas standards do not. And buildings that are taller than 55 feet have a pretty significant impact and could really benefit from that back and forth with the public. Design review is really it's a dialogue and an opportunity to meaningfully talk about site-specific and social context and respond to it. And then, as you saw on the map, most of the development outside of the central city and gateway will be lower than 75 feet. So most of the buildings won't go through design review under these proposed thresholds. So that's just kind of a flavor of kind of the testimony for and against to give you some food for thought. And that's all I have. I'm happy to answer questions.
Questions, colleagues? Commissioner Rubio.
I have a question about to date under the current under the current guidelines. How many times has it gone to design review where it's actually not been approved because of the height of up to 75? Or has that happened?
Are you asking if any projects have applied for design review and the design commission has denied the project based on the height?
Yeah, or recommended a lower height. I'm just trying to get a sense of the frequency that it actually comes up.
Stacy, can I invite you to share your thoughts with us? Are super, super rare is what I want to say.
Yes, it is. I believe the Hyatt is one of the projects which council saw. The molding and sculpting at the top ended up reducing.
Sorry, Stacy, would you introduce yourself again?
Oh,
please?
I'm sorry. Stacy Monroe with the Bureau of Development Services Design and Historic Review Team. I work with the Design Commission quite often and process design reviews. And I'm a senior planner with the team. So as I was mentioning, the Hyatt is one example. The other example was probably about 7 or 8 years ago in response to the project's adjacency to a Petty Grove Park, a public park. The zoning didn't accurately reflect the adjacent context. So there was some height reduced from that building, but it was relocated elsewhere on the site in order to make the project respond to the adjacency of the park. Those are the only two examples that I can think of.
And I just want to clarify, this isn't about the actual height limit of the building. The base zone and Some of the plan districts say how high and how much FAR, floor area ratio, how big a building can be. This is about at what point is the project a big enough impact that it should warrant a public hearing or a public process through a type 2 or type 3 design review. In this project, definitely, we took a look at all of the exemptions and we said, if someone's putting an awning on their building, we don't need to have a public hearing about that. I think we can all agree to that. So we tried to carve out what things are exempt from design review. If you're redoing your landscaping, don't come in for a public hearing. But if you're doing a big enough building, that warrants a discretionary review, either through a type 2 or type 3. So that's what the question here is, not necessarily the actual height.
Thank you. Any additional questions? So I have a question. Your counterpoints talk about that most development outside of Central City and Gateway will be lower than 75 feet. And what is that analysis based on?
Let's look at the map, right? So that
it's
map
a
again.
really hard map for me to actually place anything on. I just want you to know it's like I'm looking at a yellow paint.
So let me just point out that the areas in blue are the areas where the maximum heights are between 55 feet and 75 feet. And those are the areas that we're talking about. Our proposal is suggesting that those areas would now have the choice to go through standards, whereas today they don't. And those areas, because it's a little tricky to read, are primarily along Interstate, Sandy, there's some in Foster, Lentz, and then along MLK a little bit, and Williams, Vancouver.
Another way to think of this, Commissioner Hardesty, is let's take a look up here at St. John's. St. John's, the maximum heights are what's allowed by the base zone is 55 feet or less. So it doesn't matter if there's what the threshold is and the conversation we're having. These projects will always be afforded the opportunity to use standards. Over here, near Gateway on the East Corridor, these projects, any projects in this area, because of their base zoning, are allowed to be built higher than 75 feet. So if a project comes in and maxes out their height, where'd my mouse go? I don't even know if you can see my mouse. They will trigger a design review in the red. It's the blue areas that will be different depending on where the council lands on that amendment, on this amendment. If the council decides to go with the Planning Commission's recommendation for a 75-foot height, all of these blue areas will have the option of using standards or design review. If you decide to amend this to go to 55-foot height, which is what the current regulations are, then all of these blue areas will be treated like the red areas. If they get high enough, then they go through design review, like Gateway, like Central City is treated. Does that make sense?
It helped a lot. Thank you. Yes. I see Commissioner Ryan's hand is up. Commissioner Ryan.
Thank you, Commissioner Hardesty. All right, it's like a scenario here. So I'm really familiar with the area on Interstate and MLK and Williams. And so I assume right now, I'm assuming something, that there are a lot of buildings that are at 55 feet currently. And all I know is there's a lot of buildings that are the same height, right? And so if this changes to 75 feet, then even though they were allowed to go to 75 feet, now they really will want to go to 75 feet because they're in the standards. So you'll see they'll just go up in height. I mean, I'm speculating right now.
I'm not sure if a developer decides what to build based on the city process. Like, I don't know if developers say, oh, I want to build an 85-foot high building, but you know what? If I come in for a 55-foot high building, I'll go through standards and I can avoid design review. So I'm going to underbuild on this site. And we certainly don't want to encourage that, right? the areas that we have zoned for higher heights and more FAR, we're counting on those areas to produce those number of units. So we want to encourage, incentivize people to do the right thing.
Yeah, I believe you. I'm trying to just get to the heart of what the change is and what Portlanders might experience as being a different, a different landscape once we make this change. And I don't have a specific point of view right now as much as wanting to really understand the conversation that we're having. So when we make this change, so.
And I think perhaps this slide can help a little bit.
Thank you, Sandra. I was going to ask to put this slide back up. I do think that there's a big difference between a 55-foot and a 75-foot building. And especially when you think about the areas of town where it would be possible for these to be. And so it does immediately change the character of the neighborhood. So I just don't know if you could add 75,000 feet without going through a design review so that there's more of a neighborhood opportunity to engage in what the design looks like and how it fits into the community. So I think it reinforces for me that if there was not going to I think we could propose that an alternative, especially at 60% of MFI for I think 20 to 50% of the units, is very attractive to me, being able to expedite that. But other than that, I'm not excited about expediting 75 feet. I think if it was very narrowly focused on housing providers that were providing housing at 60% or more of MFI, I would be excited about that. I could support that. Especially seeing at the ideal locations that they will be and kind of just what traffic flow would be like. And I had another question actually for BPS as PBOT continues to look at how do we create walking neighborhoods and maybe block off some streets permanently so that we're creating meeting spaces in neighborhoods that don't actually have meeting spaces. And they could be like food carts and benches or as elaborate as artists painting the sidewalk, like the beautiful one I saw in Northeast Portland after Saturday's Spat. PBOT is really exploring doing this all over the city. So as I see like the opportunities, especially in these corner spots where community is, where we're going to put a lot of community in a very tiny spot, what kind of recommendations I think would come out of the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability around how do we think about, as we're thinking about the design of buildings, that how are we thinking about the design of how we use the public right-of-way as more of a public ownership, right? And what does that look like in relationship to these kind of new designs?
Laura, you want to take that
Any
one?
thoughts, Laura or Sandra?
Well, the buildings, if you remember the 3 tenets that we talked about, context, public realm, and quality and resilience, there's a lot of guidelines and standards that we've put into thinking about the public realm and the response to the public realm. So, really thinking about weather protection and protecting people inside and out. So it's really less about the response to the street and more about the response to the sidewalk and just creating a more inclusive and welcoming ground floor as it relates to the public sidewalk. So I don't know if that quite answers your question.
Well, I see an opportunity for synergy around some of the new envisioning because, again, PBOT doesn't know where all these spaces will be. But if you think about if we're developing on like some triangular space, right? Are there opportunities to create real walking space around that entire building, and what would that look like? I think we're all trying to think outside of the boxes that we are accustomed to working in. And so as I look at just kind of the opportunity, I do see some opportunities to be in sync with what the design commission is looking for when they're looking at, is this really going to fit in, and is this really going to enhance the community? Any opportunity for the community to build community. So thank you for putting that picture back up. I'm going to go to Commissioner Maps and see if he has any additional questions before I ask you to take the picture down.
Thank you, Commissioner Hardesty. I think this is a request to staff. I'm still thinking through this question myself around how we should review proposed tall buildings. I think earlier you showed us a slide that shows that some buildings over 55 feet have gone through type 2, some have gone through type 3 reviews. I wonder if there's been any sort of analysis on, in retrospect, can we tell the difference between a tall building that went through a type 2 review versus a tall building that went through a type 3 review? Can you look at one and go, oh, that's obviously a high quality type 3 review building? Or do they kind of all look the same? Or do we get different kinds of complaints? Or, you know, I wonder if there's any real world evidence to help me parse this out. And if it's not, if there's not, it's a relatively easy thing to do, and someone over there is interested in looking at it. I'd certainly be interested in seeing the results of that analysis.
I will say early on when we did the assessment, the disparity was not in between type 2 and type 3 design reviews, because those are using the same regulations, like Bill mentioned. Those are all using the same guidelines. The disparity was found in areas outside of the central city between projects that were using the design standards and the design guidelines. Those were resulting in very different buildings. And that is why we worked really hard with both commissions to try and respond to those three tenets and try to create regulations that were clear and objective on the standards path that would meet design guidelines. So we were really trying to respond to that disparity, but the disparity wasn't in between the type 2 and type 3 of design review. It was between the objective track and the design review track. And that's why this question of height and who gets to go through a clear and objective track is so important. But again, that's why the PSC thought, well, we've raised so that both are in parity. And this is sort of the contention and disagreement, I think, between the two commissions. So that we should just allow more buildings to use the clear and objective track. Design Commission, because design review offers that public feedback and public dialogue and discussion, still feels that going through design review will result in a higher quality building. And so that's kind of the crux of this decision. I do want to ask a question of Commissioner Hardesty, but so I just, before I forget it, but I want to make sure I answered your question, Commissioner Maps.
Yeah, I'm all set.
Commissioner Hardesty, you were mentioning that you were more interested in something that we haven't talked about, which is the 75-foot threshold to you would be more palatable if there was an affordable housing component to it. Whereas if it were market rate, you would be more eager to see the threshold continue at 55 feet. Am I capturing that correct?
You are. You are. That is exactly the right question, right? Yes. Because at least in my experience here, and I wouldn't say this in other parts of the country, but here, the affordable housing developers are deeply embedded in community. So I think they would be forced to actually do a high level of community engagement around the projects that they do. So, and because I'm on the board of a community nonprofit, Human Solutions, that actually provides affordable housing in East Portland for very low income families, I know how difficult it is to actually piece together a affordable housing package that's palpable to be able to give to a bank and make it so. I've seen behind the hood I've seen under the hood of how nonprofit housing providers are able to make that happen. I would have every confidence in them that it would be designed at a high level. I would not share that same confidence with market rate anything.
And just to connect this to the last item that we discussed about affordable housing, it seems like if we wanted to carve something out like this for affordable housing providers for this amendment, it would be the same definition of affordable housing than the previous one, correct?
That was in 1 and 2 on the previous chart when you talked about the options around. Yes. So that is correct. That would be an amendment that I would be interested in supporting or moving forward.
Does any other commissioners have a reaction to that idea?
I was having similar thoughts and conversations with my team about this exact thing. So I would be interested in looking at that as well.
Okay, well, it seems
I've
like
seen
maybe
no hope, no head. So I think what that says is we're kind of open to exploring it because we certainly know what we're doing now is not getting us close to where we need to be. So
I agree.
Okay.
I'm open to this discussion.
excellent.
Okay, great. We'll continue moving forward with that one too. We have about 10 minutes left.
And we got one more left, or do
We
you gonna
do.
tell us what next steps are? Okay.
No, we've got one more left and it's technical amendments.
Oh, I'm
which-
sorry, Commissioner Ryan, did you have another question?
Yeah, before I forget, the map, the yellow painting that Commissioner Hardesty was talking about, will you make sure that we get a copy of that in our office, please?
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's where I want to hang out a lot to try to figure out what's going on here. Thanks.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you. So our last topic is a series of technical amendments that we have been accumulating over time. Phil's been our keeper of those, and I'll let him take it away. And Phil, we need to reserve at least 5 minutes for the next steps at the end.
So I hope to make this very quick. You can see a list of 6 technical amendments that are on there. They generally are either amendments to update our DOZA proposal with other changes that have happened elsewhere in the code, or to update or clarify certain criteria, such as the rooftop equipment screening exemption. So they're fairly minor. I am going to just leave it at that. If anybody has a question or wants a little more clarification on one of these items, go ahead and ask. But in the interest of time, I was just going to stop it there.
Great.
Not seeing any questions. Excellent. Okay, so next steps.
Next steps. So thank you so much for today's conversation. I think we've gotten very decent feedback, not totally full feedback, but we'll work with your offices to figure out who wants to sponsor which amendments and which are on the table. So this is more a conversation for the public. Our plan is that we're working with your offices Thursday and Friday of this week. Monday's a holiday. Tuesday, Wednesday, we want to button it up and have them all nicely written with an explanation in plain English and the zoning code language of amendments. We would publish that on June 3rd, which is on Thursday, and we'll publish it to our website. We'll definitely send out an email to all the people who have been engaged in the DOZA process, which is a significant listserv. And then we'll open up the map app testimony, the written testimony will be open up that day also. And so folks can start reading those and testifying in writing about those amendments. On June 8th, there would be, that's the deadline that council usually has for folks to sign up to testify for the amendments. It's a 4 p.m. deadline. June 8th is a Tuesday. And then we would be back here on June 10th, which is a Thursday, for a hearing on those amendments. So that's when commissioners would move and second the amendments, and you would hear public testimony on them, and then close the written and oral record, and then vote on the amendments.
Excellent. Planned path very well laid out. I just want to double check with legal counsel that there's not something else I need to do for the sake of the public record before we adjourn today.
Nope, that sounds good. The item is continued to June 10th, and Sandra outlined when the record opens. Thank you for checking.
Thank you. And thank you all colleagues. And I can't thank BPS staff enough. Sandra, Phil, Laura, thank you all. We learned a lot. And I think it was a really healthy conversation as we continue to think and think about potential amendments. Mayor, you're back just in time to adjourn. You want to do that?
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner Hardesty. I thought you did a great job presiding, so thank you for filling in. I did want to just add one thing, since we're going to hear public testimony at the next session. I would also like, and I really appreciate my colleagues suggesting some innovations and ideas, many of which I am open-minded to. I would really like to hear testimony from those who are the developers of affordable housing in particular. I'd like to know the economics and what you're looking at in terms of capital stacks and how this might impact your ability either positively or potentially negatively in terms of being able to develop in Portland. We all understand capital is no longer local. Capital is global, and capital will go where capital can be maximized in many cases. And while I want to maintain our high standards and make sure that our built environment is worthy of our community and lives up to the standards of the community, I also want to know that we can continue to develop particularly the affordable housing side of the equation. So I'd love to hear from as many people who want to testify on that matter as possible, either in written form, which is fine, or in person when we have oral testimony. So with that, again, thank you, Commissioner Hardesty. Thank you, colleagues. BPS, you guys outdid yourself with a terrific presentation in record time, actually a few minutes early, I might add. We are adjourned. Thank you.